And good afternoon, everyone. I'm assuming you're coming in from the East Coast, so a pleasant afternoon to all of you. A little bit about me. I did my PhD work at USC in Los Angeles and have taught on 6 continents. My work in negotiation goes back over 20 years. I have a couple of textbooks that are in now the 2nd and soon to be 7th edition around negotiation and interpersonal skills. And the other thing that Brett didn't mention is that within executive development, I have designed and I run a program for women only. And I won't say too much more about that. It's a 3-day intense, experiential, transformative program for women mid to senior career on how to be a better negotiator, how to engage and be successful at the negotiating table. And just briefly, in my guess that some of the participants are women, what you may not know is women engage in negotiation far less frequently than do men, and they tend to be less successful for a variety of reasons. And so if this is an area of interest to you or to someone you know, reach out to me, reach out to Brett. We also have a LinkedIn channel that I've been posting information about this to kind of help, shall we say, close the gap. Anyway, that's enough about me, and I look forward to hearing your questions. In general, there's going to be about a half an hour at the end, but if you have a burning question, then please do use the chat, and if I don't notice it, perhaps Brett will, and I'm willing to be interrupted. So that's great with me. So with that, the first thing I want to do before I just show you my screen is I just have a quick question. You know, we're all in this together. We're all dealing with the effects of this pandemic. And my question for you, and I'd like you to participate, before COVID hit, approximately what % of your negotiations, whether for your employer or for you in your own business personally, were done virtually versus face-to-face?
Answers are rolling into the poll.
Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. I think I picked a good topic, Brett. Carrie is asking where the poll is. If you click on the bottom of your screen when you roll over and see the polls, you should be able to pull it up. But yeah, we have still 10 people who haven't weighed in on the poll. Well, not to keep you waiting, if you can see as well as I can, we have 64% of participants whose answer was between 0 and 24%. In fact, for all we know, a good part of that 64%, 27 of you, may have been 0. That anytime there was an opportunity to negotiate, you did face-to-face, over coffee, over drinks, over dinner. And so I'm glad you're here, because while there are a lot of similarities between traditional or face-to-face negotiation, there are some additional considerations and challenges that are worth talking about, and that's what I'm going to do next. All right, so I want to just tell you briefly what we're going to talk about, and that is, since we've already done the introductions, virtual and what that means. I'll mention that briefly. I want to talk briefly also about what are the benefits and challenges to negotiating virtually. You might not realize it, but there are actually some benefits. We're going to spend the majority of our time about the process. What can you do before in your preparation, at the very start of a virtual negotiation, during that meeting itself, and as you're nearing the end? What are some things that really make a difference and help not only you achieve what you hope to achieve in the negotiation, but also build the relationship at the same time? And I also added one slide because I realized that some of you may be self-employed, maybe entrepreneurs, maybe running a small business. And so, not that it's different, but there's a few points I want to raise in terms of when you're negotiating for your employer versus yourself. And then, as I said, time for some questions. Let me know if I'm going too fast or too slow, but I'm just going to kind of barrel right in. So when we talk about virtual, quite simply, that means not face-to-face. And frankly, we have had the means to do virtual negotiations for decades. Back in the day, I'm dating myself, we had telex, fax, and even today we have asynchronous versions that are email and text, etc. So when we say virtual, it only means not face to face. When we add in the new options, phone, video conference, Skype, Zoom, BlueJeans, WebEx, GoToMeeting, you name it, anybody with a phone, a smartphone, is able to participate in a virtual negotiation. So what's my advice? The richer, the better. If you have an option to have a full-on video conference, take it. Because so much, as you see in the slide there, so much of what's communicated is not in our words. So much of what is communicated is in our body language and the tone of our voice, the inflection, how close we stand to one another. And so if you resort to having a negotiation via email or fax or text, you're missing so much of what's really happening in this negotiation. And the quick example down there I share is that, you know, a speaker in a negotiation may have believed that he clearly communicated that I need to have this delivery as soon as possible. When the listener, may they have heard is something a bit more, oh, okay, you know, within a week or two. Just because the body language was something more relaxed, the tone of the voice was more monotonic than, I need this now. So sorry if I woke you up. So again, the richer, the better if you can do it one step further. And this also echoes the research that we've seen in virtual teaming. If you're negotiating with a group of people that you've never met before face to face, my advice is not going to be heeded in this moment in our social distancing world, but when it's possible to have a first meeting face to face, there's a fair bit of research that shows a greater chance to build trust, which is so important in the relationship and how that relates to negotiation. But obviously, barring that, there are ways to build trust even in a virtual environment. So I mentioned that there are some benefits. One is obvious, you know, the amount of money and time that is spent when you have people dispersed all over the world coming together to do a negotiation. Obviously, that's no longer necessary. And with the technology we have available, this is really quite easy. And even, you know, before COVID, anybody who has physical challenges, you know, they're unable to get around easily, or perhaps their child is home from school and they need to stay home, you know, having the ability to do negotiations virtually is really quite a benefit. Another thing that's really kind of cool, if any of you have ever used Facebook Live or Periscope or any of these other platforms, you can, within the scope of a negotiation, gather real-time data from your constituents. One of my executive colleagues, who's a high-level negotiator for Microsoft, he was doing a negotiation in Berlin, and the platform that he was selling, the municipality there, the mayor, or the equivalent of mayor in Berlin, was pretty sure about his decision for this purchase, but he did a real quick shout out to his followers on social media, got the details right away, and was able to make the decision on the spot. So again, one of the benefits of virtual. Another kind of surprising benefit in terms of virtual negotiations is that while nonverbals are a good thing, right? You can better sense where people are coming from. The body doesn't lie, and I'll mention that a little bit later. Sometimes the way you feel around someone, perhaps because of their size, because of their title, because of the role that they've played in your life, you can find yourself more defensive, more afraid. And there's a great example in one of my textbooks about a couple that was going through a very difficult divorce. And each time the two of them were in front of the judge or the mediator, the woman would break down in tears and they couldn't complete the negotiation. And then what they did is they separated the two litigants into different rooms. in the courtroom, I mean, in the facility, where she was able to have this conversation with the means of virtual communication and actually got through it. She was no longer fearful of her soon-to-be ex-husband. So I know it's off the topic of business, but it's just something about nonverbals are positive, but they can also evoke strong emotional feelings. And then finally, when the negotiation is asynchronous, so you're back and forth between email and scheduled phone calls, unlike doing this face-to-face, this gives you more time to consider the issues, come up with different options, etc. So that's a potential benefit. So hopefully these are a little bit new or not all unexpected. In terms of some of the challenges, obviously, as I mentioned before, when you strip away the tone, the body language, being able to see, you also increase the likelihood of misunderstanding, misinterpreting. And we've all heard stories of this before. Somebody who doesn't know better and types their response in all caps, "Don't shout at me." This is something that I'm sure you've heard of. Another challenge in virtual negotiations is this idea that when we can't see somebody or we can't see them well, perhaps we're using video conference, but they're far back or the lighting is not very good. When we don't have that eye contact, when we don't feel like we're really building the relationship, there's some research that suggests people are less willing to disclose information that's relevant to the negotiation. And there's also a potential for parties to act less ethically. It's like we're not being watched, right? So, what's happening behind the screen? What am I doing? Obviously, another challenge too is this idea that if, or maybe we should say when, technology falters, what's our backup plan? How else can we continue this negotiation if Skype goes down or if Blue Jeans are, and within the government contracting arena, of course, we're hearing a lot about the need for a secure platform and what that looks like. And so again, we may all have smartphones, but we may not all have access to these secure platforms. I think another challenge is that the fact that there still are demographic differences, gender differences, cultural differences, they still apply. And if in one culture time is relative, the meeting starts más o menos 2 p.m. Well, it would never be 2 p.m., but let's say 11 in the morning. They still apply in virtual settings. So, doing your homework, as always, is critical. And then finally, if the conversations are asynchronous in a virtual negotiation, this lengthens the time that this negotiation takes to get it done because you're waiting for the starts and the stops. So the next few slides, I want to talk about what are some things that you can do before the meeting and during and after to really capitalize on the benefits, minimize the challenges, and really try to get a good outcome, both in terms of what you're getting and the relationship. So clarifying the details, how are we going to meet? What issues exactly are we going to discuss or not? Who's coming? What platforms are we using? Are we recording it? If so, do we need to get everyone's buy-in and their willingness to have this session recorded? And then even the simple things like a place that has good lighting and a simple, not too cluttered background. I'm sure you've all seen skits and parodies of the dog coming in or the dog's barking or, the little child naked running into the room. As much as possible, you want to minimize those potential disruptions. Another key thing about virtual negotiations is you need to resist the temptation to think that because I'm here at my home or my office and I have access to all of my papers, my documents, etc., I don't have to prepare because I have it all at my fingertips. That's not realistic. I mean, first of all, if this is a job negotiation, you're going to be nervous. And when you're nervous, your ability to be logical and competent and present yourself credibly is going to potentially be in question. So in the same way that you would prepare, what are my goals and why? What are those interests? What is my best alternative to a negotiated agreement, BATNA? What might be some outcomes that both parties would see as good outcomes, potentially great outcomes, and thinking ahead, what questions do I want to ask? What are the roles in our team? If you're a team of 2 or 3 from your company negotiating with another team, who's going to be the lead negotiator? Is everybody going to jump in at the same time? Is one of you going to play the role of a facilitator? And I'll come back to that in a moment as well. And of course, before, it's always a good idea to do a test run. Brett and I got on about 20 minutes before this session started, and already I was finding some glitches that we were able to iron out. Do the same. And here's another little pro tip. I'm sure many of you, before you go on a job interview, you go online, you check out this person on LinkedIn, you look at their platform, maybe check them out on Instagram or Facebook. Well, here's the thing. That's their first impression of you. You know they're going to look you up. They're going to do some social media stalking. Do the same. Not just of them, but of you. Know what they're going to know about you and potential issues or concerns they might have. For example, you may have moved around a lot or have just started in a current company, and they might ask you, well, what do you know about this particular company? Did we just get a question there, Brett?
We did. Could you explain what BATNA is again?
Sure. That is a more advanced, if you will, term in negotiation, BATNA. And I give you a great book recommendation, Fisher and Urey and Batten's Getting to Yes. BATNA is a best alternative to a negotiated agreement. It is mistakenly thought of as bottom line, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Bottom line is, what's the bare minimum that I would expect and what I would accept before walking away from this negotiation? A best alternative is, here's what I want. These are 2 or 3 outcomes that would be really good for these reasons. And among those, I'm going to prioritize those. This is a best. So rather than have a negotiation at all, which would be a bad outcome, potentially, what is my best outcome relative to not having negotiated at all? So it's one step below my ideal outcome. Did we have another question?
Oh, we do not. Some of the Mason MBA alumni and I are giving each other a hard time about who is being the suck up to Professor de Janasz. So that's.
Ooh. Okay, let me move along. So at the start, so you've done this preparation on your own with your team, both from a content and a process perspective, right? At the start of the meeting, remember the human. Remember that we are human. There's a great article and book that came out a couple of years ago by Nick Morgan and HBR, and there's a book and there's an extraction that's an article, 5 Big Problems in the Virtual World. And he talks about lack of feedback, lack of empathy, lack of control, lack of emotion, lack of connection. And in the virtual world, this is a virtual negotiation. Be mindful of how you can come across as human, not that we have to try, right? But how you come across, really put an effort in showing emotion appropriately, and really put an effort into responding to others' nonverbal cues. Related to that, make sure you start this virtual meeting with some kind of informal water cooler check-in, like, hey, how was your weekend? Or, I wouldn't say, did you read the news, because it's pretty depressing day after day. But I start my class, I'm teaching a virtual class here at Mason. I start with, has anybody had any good news in this last week? Something positive that happened to them? The thing is, it's not just chit chat. It actually, research shows that having small talk not only builds rapport, but it also reduces the negative impact that differences that we have between us have on how we feel about one another and our negotiation. So that's the informal piece. The formal piece is important as well. don't just launch in, even if you've met people before. Again, sometimes the cameras aren't working or not working well, or the lighting is not good. Take a few moments to go around the table and do a formal introduction, and use the opportunity to provide a brief background of your expertise, your title, perhaps, what projects you're working on. It's never too early or too unoften to build credibility. And by the way, this is something that I talk about a lot in the women's negotiation program, because women have a tendency, because of how we are expected to behave in this Western culture, we have a tendency to not brag, and we really deny ourselves the opportunity to build that credibility of our expertise and our know-how and our experience. I would also highly recommend, if not one of you at the meeting, bringing in a skilled facilitator. As helpful as it is to have a facilitator in a regular negotiation face-to-face because of the nature of human beings and dynamics, it's even more important because people are often forgotten about, because we don't see the body language, we don't see them pushing away from the table. This is a reason to have somebody who's trained in group process, to kind of, hey, Brett, I haven't heard from you in a while. What are you thinking? And I mean, there's more to facilitation than that, but that's just a brief reminder of what that is. Okay, 2 more quick things about at the start, and then we'll get to the next. So I know that we're all online today, and we're online every day. And I don't know about you, but it's not that hard to get me to lose focus. And maybe you've already lost focus. So how do you get people engaged right from the start and throughout? And one of the things that you can do is early on, I mean, maybe 60 seconds is a little bit soon, but after the introductions, make the case for this negotiation, for this meeting, compelling. If we can agree on price, if we can agree on this joint venture, this is going to revolutionize the way we deliver service in the AI world. Make the case compelling and do it soon. This is really critical. And also clarify the timing of this meeting. We're meeting for 1 hour, or we're speaking for half an hour. If you make it clear what the breaks are, and also make a verbal appeal for focus, like, hey guys, I know we all fall prey to multitasking. Let's be mindful. Let's try not to do that for the next 30 minutes, by the way. Okay, so we have a question?
No, we do not.
Okay, so meeting has begun, the negotiation, the meeting. How do you keep people engaged? Well, don't do what I'm doing. Don't talk the whole time. Find ways, create opportunities for others to participate meaningfully. And by that, throughout, like we used a poll. Every one of you got involved and shared your feedback. There's Slack channel, depending on the medium that you're using, breakout groups, but not breakout groups for the sake of breakout groups. Perhaps it's a problem you're trying to solve, and you point out the question or the topic of the brainstorm and say, okay, and be clear, for the next 5 minutes, I'm going to put you in random breakout rooms, virtual breakout rooms, and your topic is X. 3 in a room, go. I'll bring you back in, and then we'll see what you come up with. And it works the same as it does in a large meeting. People who are reticent to speak up in a large group are far more willing to talk when it's a group of 2 or 3, and it engages them. So that's really important. Having a messaging platform like we have here. The other thing you could do is, when there is a key decision that is being put forth to the group, you use a process tool like the round robin to ensure everyone is heard. So rather than say, okay, it sounds like that we're going to move ahead with this new bonus system. Everybody on board? All right, good, it passes. Yeah, don't do that. Don't do that. Because what silence means is probably one of the most misunderstood and misinterpreted form of nonverbal communication there is. But let me get back to this. This idea is just very simple. There are 5 people in the room. Hey, let's hear from everyone. Are you okay with this? Let's just, point to each person, or, name Brett, Jan, Stephanie, etc. In order to keep our attention, minimize the number of slides. That's pretty obvious. But again, because this is a virtual, and again, the less communication richness, even more importantly, often and early, check assumptions, ask questions, check body language, paraphrase what you're hearing. The body language is so much more honest, research shows. And it goes back to kind of how our bodies have evolved in the limbic system, that, our body language, the fear that we show, the disgust that we show, this is a way that our body helps us react to our environment and stay safe. So if you're seeing somebody's body language, like Brett just furrowed his brow just now, if you're seeing a change in someone's body language, check in as quickly as you can. It may be nothing, but it may be something. And then use the caucus, which is a fancy way of saying a timeout in negotiation. And so that might just be, all right, as we agreed, we're going to take a 10-minute break. My advice to you is to turn off your microphone, turn off your video, especially if you're using the bathroom. By the way, there's a great skit that was done on Saturday Night Live this past Saturday that shows some real mess ups in a virtual meeting. I leave it to you to check that out. Okay,
Suzanne,
nearing the end. Yeah?
Sorry, we had a question about what is round robin? Is that a communication tool?
Okay, so a round robin is just that. It's a facilitation tool where you literally point to each person in the room one at a time. Sometimes people do it with a ball or a baton, or, okay, what do you think, Brett? Well, I'm okay with it. Jen, what do you think? Well, I'm okay with it. Oh, Kirsten, actually, I'm still not okay. What are we going to do about this issue? So, I don't know why it's called round robin, kind of like maybe after the children's game, like a duck, duck, goose, round robin. But that's what that is. Thanks for the question. All right. So as I mentioned before, sometimes our body language doesn't always align with our words. And when we have chats, and this is something interesting in some of the research I did for today, you might find that what's being said in private or semi-private chats may not match what was actually decided. And then there's this misalignment. So it's really important near the end of a meeting, reviewing what did we agree on? What haven't we still come to closure on? What do we want to talk about next time? So make clear what it is that we have and haven't agreed. When is the next meeting? Who's hosting it? What platform are we using? What's still open for us to discuss? And then, like any good meeting, do a quick process check, or one I used when I was in the aerospace industry. We called it the B's and C's, the benefits of this meeting, the challenges that we experienced or concerns. But just a quick go around, because what happens is if I have felt stepped on, mansplained over, ignored, and I say nothing, I'm going to bring that resentment with me to the next meeting, and so will others. And so having a forum, ever so brief, to have people kind of voice what they're feeling about the meeting, about the negotiation, kind of clears the air, and it gets people usually to be mindful about the next meeting. So my last slide is kind of keeping in mind that many of you may not work for some large employer or government contractor, but rather you're in business for yourself. Like we have one person doing a job, an offer right now. Well, my advice to you, whether virtual or face-to-face, the fact that we're kind of in this mode, while scary and while difficult, is also an opportunity. There's no time like the present to capitalize on what I call everyday negotiations. For those of you who find yourself uncomfortable asking for your salary, or who feel uncomfortable changing the rules in a department store, well, this has a stain on it, can I get 25% off? For a lot of people, the virtual mechanism lowers the risk, lowers the fear factor. So I suggest to you that this is an opportune time to practice and build that muscle of competence and confidence by doing some of these things. For example, calling up your your credit card company and negotiating for a lower interest rate. Do your homework first, but trust me, I've had a lot of success on that. I just talked to Priority Pass. Since I've been traveling less, I've lost my gold privileges. So, and I sent them a note like, hey, I haven't heard from you guys. Are we going to continue with expiration at 1 year when none of us is flying at the moment? I'll let you know how that turns out. I have a number of friends who have WeWork spaces. And I've been encouraging them to negotiate with the owners to reduce the rent, gain more favorable terms, extend the time for the same money, things like that. And, you know, again, it's up to you what you want to negotiate. But it's not just a matter of saving a few dollars. It's about really feeling more comfortable in the simpler, low-risk negotiations in order to be ready and comfortable for the bigger ones. One last thing I'll mention too is, you know, now when we're all kind of in this mode, bartering has come back. And I've noticed that there are some people who are really handy with a sewing machine. Hey, if you can make me a couple of masks, I'll send you, you know, I'll bring over, socially distant, of course, you know, a batch of my best cookies, that kind of thing. Well, that's negotiating too. Anyway, I'll end on that fun note and take your questions.
So one thing I had teed up while you were in your last couple of slides, Suzanne, was to ask them what are some of their challenges that they feel like they face in there. So I want to kind of run through, we got a couple of these and just kind of see what you think about some of them. I thought this was interesting. You know, one of the attendees, you know, online they struggle eye strain, which I think is kind of interesting. Offline, it's the lack of tone color when communicating. And I could definitely see that.
I'm not sure.
There's no question. I just want to know if you wanted to. They said that was a challenge. We can kind of. I think one potentially advice is I don't want to sound like I'm mansplaining something. I want to be able to explain my position without offending anyone. So do you have advice for a male in that negotiation to not come across like that?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing to do is ask, well, what's your take on this to the other person, right? Rather than assume that they don't know what you know. What's your take on this? Or what do you think about this? Or what's your preference and why? Why is perhaps one of the easiest and most powerful questions we can use in negotiation, because we often get stuck at the what. What do I want? I want more money. I want a bigger bonus. I want a better job. And why? Well, I mean, some of that might seem obvious, but without asking the question, we project on others what the answer of why is, and we may be absolutely wrong. So why is a great question I would remind you all.
Yeah, one I really want to bring up, one of the attendees has brought up a lot about job negotiation, and specifically, you know, you don't want to feel like you're asking potentially for too much, but how do you negotiate well for your salary?
Where do I begin? That's a whole topic. I mean, the first answer to the question is do your research. Do your research, right? Many years ago, we didn't have access to the kind of data we have access to now. So whether it's on Glassdoor or LinkedIn or any of these places, start out by doing your research. What does a person in a role like this, with the education and the experience that you have, make in this area, in this geographic region? And these are all relevant pieces. And once you find that out, then you can start preparing to be able to speak to that. Now, there are traps, right? One of the first questions that when a recruiter is thinking about making an offer to you, one of their favorite questions is, what are you making right now? Don't fall into that trap. I would respond to that question directly with, what are you paying for a person in this kind of role with this kind of experience and background and education? Put it back on them. Because, you know, this again, it's unfortunate. We have, 23 million people unemployed at the moment, or who have filed for unemployment, I should say. And, you know, we're hopefully we're going to see a rebound in the economy. I'll leave that to Jason and all of those folks and Derek to talk about that in their seminar. But when the time comes, what you were making, how long you were laid off is far less relevant to what does the skill set that you possess, what is it worth, what value can you bring to the company, what savings have you managed to create for a company, what new business have you brought in, how many millions of dollars, how many reductions of cycle time have you, so these are the things that are relevant. How much you pay in rent, not relevant.
Right. I do want to bring up this one because it actually comes in quite a bit of the sales literature, but what does silence during a meeting mean?
Yes, no. So early in my career, I was in the aerospace industry. I worked for Lockheed and I worked for Hughes in Southern California. And what I did back then is I facilitated hundreds of meetings that were cross-functional, diagonal, new product development teams, process action improvement teams, top management teams. And as I said earlier, I would say that silence is probably one of the most misunderstood forms of nonverbal communication. And so one of the things that I would have a group do early in its existence is I would ask them specifically to go around the room, round robin, and define what silence means to them. So for example, a big question comes to the group and it's, okay, everybody, are we okay with X? And then there's silence. And then you go around the room and you ask, okay, you're silent. What does that mean? I'm still thinking. What does it mean for you? I don't have all the data. I need time. What does it mean for you? I'm so pissed off that I'm not ready to speak. And on and on and on. And so the answer is silence means that you need more information.
I will say from a sales perspective, this is one of the first tricks I learned on the trading floor. And it was actually the seasoned veterans in our organization who told me as a salesman, do not break the silence in a sales call. So let it hang, because if you have an awkward, uncomfortable kind of moment, it's usually when you're getting to the price negotiation. And it was put the onus on the customer to actually come back with what they're looking for.
Oh.
And you could see the elder individuals were so good at letting that silence drag. And it was like a running almost kind of joke in the firm of like, the longer you let it go, the better deal you got on the sale.
Brett, you're so right. And there's story after story of the inexperienced negotiator who interprets the silence as disagreement and says, okay, I'll knock 10% off. I'll knock 20% off.
Right.
I'll throw in free delivery. And by the way, there's also cultural differences. So for example, two ends of the spectrum are the Japanese and the Brazilians. The Japanese tend to use the most silence. Americans are about in the middle. And Brazilians are very comfortable talking simultaneously. Now, we might see that as rude, that you're interrupting one another, but it's a very common mode of communicating in Brazil. So, what you said holds, and also there are some cross-cultural considerations in this.
Yeah, absolutely. Want to get to some of these other ones. Great questions coming in, so please keep them up from the attendees. We're going to try to get to as many of these as we can. How do you prepare for negotiating a full-time position from part-time intern role during this whole hiring freeze recessionary period? What if the best case scenario is not met?
So if what I'm hearing from that, the first part of the question is, it's the same, right? However you prepare for a negotiation, gathering the data, knowing what you're worth, knowing what you offer a company, etc. Now, there's another piece of it. What if, and I'm thinking specifically of those who are changing careers, those who may be looking for an internship. It depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking to gain experience, if you're looking to have a high brand value company on your CV, there may be things that you would be willing to accept, even if it's a lower rate of pay. Or maybe what you're looking for is project work. So maybe the salary that they're offering you doesn't kind of amount to what you're looking for. You might be able to negotiate on a project basis, paid by the hour, and add 37%, because 37% on average is what organizations pay in terms of the benefits, healthcare and days off and all this other stuff. So if that answers the question, great. If not, come back at me.
I think this one's interesting. Sometimes I don't know who is driving the discussion during a negotiation. So how do you avoid that awkwardness?
Can the person say a little bit more? Who's driving?
We'll wait
I'm
for,
not sure I understand.
yeah, we'll wait for them to come back.
Okay.
I do like this one. Is it inappropriate to ask for a promotion or job title change right now?
No, it's not. However, again, it's got to be based on something. It's not my rent went up or my partner was laid off and so we're low on funds. It's got to be based on performance, value added, and also, you know, I'm not a fan at all of ultimatums, but you are stronger in your position. You have far more leverage if you have another offer. And so, you know, you might have to be willing to leave to get what you're looking for. Although right now, this is a pretty tough environment in which to do that. However, there are plenty of companies that are hiring right now.
Yeah. Sorry, looking at some of these other ones. It's a really interesting question. I want to get to this. What's the impact of the mute button in the virtual environment and how that differentiates the virtual session from face-to-face? I think that's brilliant. Such a great question, Amir. I'll give you a shout out for that one.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there are a lot of ways to interpret that. You know, one of the things that I make a really big point of in the women's negotiation program is this: only negotiate when you're ready. And I say that because sometimes we find ourselves in the middle of a negotiation that we didn't ask for, we didn't want. Brett, I saw that memo. I need to talk to you. And you're like, back against the wall. And our tendency, and I think it's women more so than men, is to, okay, what do you need? Tell me what you want. You're not prepared. You haven't done your research. You haven't gathered the appropriate data. You haven't given your emotional system a chance to kind of like relax, because when our emotions are all going like this, our ability to be creative and problem solving is limited severely. So the first part of the question I want to say is, when you are pushed to negotiate, the way I would respond to this little example I gave Brett is, you're right, Brett, that's a conversation we definitely should have. How's your Monday at 2 o'clock looking? And be matter of fact, be assertive about it. And if someone says, no, I want to talk now, I would say, okay, I hear you. And I think that this conversation is going to be better and result in better outcomes for both of us if we both have had a chance to review what's at stake in this conversation. So I'd appreciate if we can schedule this conversation Monday at 2. Does that work for you?
I want to get to back to the previous question about driving a discussion, and they wrote back in regards to somewhat leading a discussion. And I want to add a little bit of a spin to this. In a lot of the virtual environments or team selling right now, you may actually have more than one team member who's on the call in negotiation. And I think that is kind of an interesting space of how do you play the who leads, who's supporting in those different virtual negotiation scenarios.
So when you're preparing as a team, you not only decide who gathers what data, but also you decide who plays what role. And there are some people who would really like to not be the lead negotiator. There are some that want to. And it generally helps, in all the research that I've looked at, it helps when there are 3 or 4 or 6 or 12 people at the table to not have everybody talking at the same time. So within your team, you have this discussion and you know, perhaps you decide, well, hey, Brett, seems like you've had the most experience with this particular client. Why don't you play lead? And then, you know, should we need first one of us to jump in with particular subject matter expertise, we'll do that. But have clarity on who's playing what role. It may be the next time your team negotiates, you take a different spin. The other thing I will say that's important is, in addition to deciding who is the lead negotiator, decide amongst your 2 or 3 people of a team, which one of you wants to be the one who is playing more of a facilitator role. And by that, who's really focusing on, remember, body language never lies. So when we're so busy trying to move this negotiation along, or as one of the questioners said, drive the negotiation, it's really hard to focus on content and process 100%. And so designating someone as the facilitator or the body language interpreter, and then using the caucus or the timeout periodically to kind of get back with your group and regroup. Okay, how's it going? What do we want to shift in our strategy? What is being said verbally that does or doesn't match with the nonverbals on their side? And just kind of, re-strategize, pivot if you need to. One other thing I realized I didn't answer completely in the last question about the use of the mute button. I wouldn't use it in a manipulative way. I wouldn't make this eye contact and then say, oh, put on the mute and start talking to somebody like this. That reduces trust. That reduces trust. But if instead you say, oh my gosh, it's an emergency phone call from, insert name of family member here, would you excuse me for 5 minutes? I would turn on the mute button and I would walk out of the room. So I would not use it manipulatively, because as I said, as critical as trust is in negotiations, it's even more difficult to make happen in a virtual setting. So you don't want to undermine it by doing things like that.
Great. There's actually there's a couple different themes of questions that are emerging. So I want to kind of get to both of these in
Sure.
different orders. There's several questions coming back to kind of the HR side, coming back to how do you negotiate for yourself, especially in that job. So I want to start coming back with that. And especially some questions came about how you're dealing with the recruiter, to pull on that thread that you had discussed before of people are commenting that the recruiter has thrown back that argument to them. When you say, well, what is this job worth? It will say, well, what do you think the market is for this? Or, the recruiter is asking them to continue to provide some information. So when you get that continuing push from them.
Sure. Well, again, there's no substitute for doing your homework. So do your homework, know what the ranges are. Now, the one thing that is not uncommon, I have a number of students who go into government jobs and they'll come back to me and they'll say, pay is fixed. I'm going to have to accept that as given, because it's been a long time since I've had a lot to do with the government sector. But then the question becomes, is the job classification accurate, right? If you change job classification, now you're in a different band of pay. And that's a different story. And so maybe it's a matter of not trying to negotiate the pay, but rather the job classification. And again, with the research that you've done, and in addition to gathering data, you can also use your LinkedIn accounts to see who you know at those organizations you're going to potentially interview with, and use your network, use your Mason connection. Again, building trust. Hey, Brett, I noticed that you have a job in Mason. I'm a graduate from 2011. I wonder if I can pick your brain, take you out for a coffee, and talk a little bit about what it's like working at Mason. I have a job application in there, and I'd be interested to hear directly from you. So when I say research, I don't just mean, look at the static information online about salary and what does Glassdoor say, but try to get a sense of the culture, because, nothing says fit and alignment like culture. You could be paid a lot of money, but if the fit's really bad, you're not going to do well and you're going to want to leave.
I really like that suggestion of finding somebody within the firm. And it reminds me, it was about 18 months ago where I had a mutual connection connect me with someone who was interested in becoming one of our foundation's faculty in the School of Business. And so this person leveraged that, mutual party to connect the two of us to go get coffee. And so he could get he was in the job application process. So he wanted the unofficial view of what it was like at working at Mason. And I think it must have gone well, because he's now teaching multiple courses for us. But I think that's a great strategy for people to use. On the other side, I want to come back to the other theme, which is sales that are coming through. And we've talked, some of it is, from the customer side, and you mentioned calling in and negotiating for yourself a better credits or better credit limit, better credit ratings. But one actually came from the other side. You're the supplier, you're the firm side of saying, how do I respond to my customers who are coming in and calling and asking for better terms, especially when those terms are set to expire maybe in the next couple months or next couple weeks?
Well, I mean, there are goals and suggested guidelines within your company. And the thing is, when you hear someone say this is a once in a century pandemic, this is a once in a century pandemic. I hope I never see another one in my life. And so you could sort of be indignant and say, well, I'm not lowering my price at all. We've been in business for X number of years. Well, guess what? People are struggling right now. 23 million people are unemployed. Others are partly employed. People are losing their health insurance. And so organizations that are showing their kindness, showing their flexibility, showing their willingness to work with people are not only keeping their customers, but they're gaining a reputation for being more than just, a capitalistic institution. So I think it's worthwhile to do two things. One, again, recognize what the goals of the organization are and the why behind it, but also think about, sales is a great example. It's about cost. It's about delivery dates. It's about payment terms. It's about quality. You can have different standards. So if one of these things is not really negotiable, then you want to kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Separate the different terms within the agreement and provide something on another term where you can, so that you're at least pleasing the customer in some way, even if you can't give on the price.
Right. I think that's a great tactic to use as a salesperson, anybody who's boundary spanner. If you think you have a product and a service, where can you give and where can you not? Where's a way to give that give and take so that somebody's winning? Both sides are coming away from the negotiation feeling like they got something. Want to before we get to kind of these last little questions, we have a couple more minutes, but I want to see can you raise your hand in the attendees if you are a Mason alumni or current student? We're trying to get a good sense of who's coming here from the Mason family.
No.
All right, so we're at 20 of 38 people, so that's incredible, awesome.
That's awesome.
We did get a question about does Mason, and I believe we do. So please correct me if I'm wrong. The management department does have an undergrad negotiations course, I believe.
Yes.
We do at the graduate level in the MBA program.
Yes, we do.
Great. Okay. That, at least in terms of all the major questions we'll see, I do want to get to one comment, which I thought was funny, who had said when we were talking about the why of being a great question, you said, why is a awful question to your teen? As a parent, and I will say I have two small children, and I will say, why is the most annoying question that you constantly get as parents?
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to disagree. I am a mother of 25-year-old twins. And from the time they were very young, I told them, look, throwing yourself on the floor and banging your fists is not going to work for me. If you can make an argument as to why you should get that ball or that doll or whatever, I will listen to it. And I'll tell you what, my kids have grown to be some fantastic negotiators. And yeah, it means that I have to give up more, but I'd rather them develop that skill than not. And one of the things that we know from the research is people who have strong negotiation skills are more at ease, more comfortable. They don't fear conflict. They don't avoid conflict. And they could not only have higher salaries and all this other stuff, but they can live a more stress-free life because they know that when conflict arises, and it will, they have the skills to manage it.
All right, great. Thank you so much. There's a couple more minutes. We can go ahead and end up here. If there's any last kind of questions, feel free to try to get them in real quickly before we get done. But I do want to thank you, Suzanne, so much for taking time out of your day to provide this. This was fantastic, amazing content for people. I do want to thank the attendees for coming. We really appreciate all of your effort and time. This is something that at Mason in the School of Business and Executive Development that we are committed to, and we will have more content coming out. So continue to look into those email boxes and those social media posts for more webinars like this. So we look forward to seeing you in the future. And Suzanne, any final points before we say goodbye?
Hey, stay in touch. I'm on LinkedIn. I do post a lot of stuff around negotiation and women in negotiation, and also I do a lot of work in the area of mentoring. So yeah, stay in touch.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We will go ahead and end it here. And so thank you all for joining today, and we will see you again in the future.
Take care, stay safe, wash your hands.